v. There is a mansion inside Windsor Great Park with 120 rooms, 51 acres of private grounds, and a rent so low it barely qualifies as rent at all. It belongs, in a manner of speaking, to Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh. And in 2025 and 2026, as the royal family's finances were dragged into public view one document at a time, the terms of that arrangement finally became impossible to ignore. To understand why this story matters now, you have to start with a very different royal, in a very different house, just a few miles away. For most of 2025, the name dominating royal headlines was not Edward's. It was his older brother's. Prince Andrew had lived for 2 decades at Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate, under a lease arrangement that eventually collapsed into public scandal. Reporting revealed that Andrew paid what is known as a peppercorn rent, a nominal, largely symbolic sum, in his case reportedly as little as 1 peppercorn a year if it was ever even demanded. That detail, combined with his connections to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, proved fatal to his position within the family. Andrew was stripped of his royal titles, and by late 2025 it was confirmed he would be leaving Royal Lodge altogether, with the move expected sometime in 2026. He has consistently denied the allegations made against him, but the financial arrangement itself was no longer something the palace could quietly explain away. It was in the aftermath of that story that attention swung toward Bagshot Park, and toward the brother who was supposed to be the reliable one. Prince Edward first took on the lease for Bagshot Park in March 1998, together with his wife, Sophie, now the Duchess of Edinburgh. At the time, the property was in poor condition. The Ministry of Defense had vacated the site in 1996, the building had gone unmaintained for years, and the Crown Estate had actually fielded proposals to convert it into a hotel or conference center rather than keep it as a royal residence. Instead, it went to Edward, under a 50-year lease with an opening annual rent of just £5,000. That low figure came with strings attached. Edward was expected to fund a serious renovation of the property, and he did, contributing roughly £1.36 million of his own money toward repairs, while the Crown Estate covered the remaining costs of a refurbishment that ultimately totaled somewhere around £3 million. Once that work was completed, his rent rose to £90,000 a year, a figure the National Audit Office at the time confirmed reflected market value. For a period, at least, Edward's arrangement looked like the responsible counterexample to whatever was happening at Royal Lodge, a working royal who put his own money into a crown property and paid what the government's own auditors called fair rate. Then, in 2007, the story quietly changed. That year, Edward extended his lease through a company called Eclipse Nominees Limited, paying roughly £5 million upfront to secure a new 150-year term. At the time, that premium was described as market-tested. But according to reporting from the Times and other outlets, something happened after that renewal. The ongoing rent figures on the property's land registry filing were redacted. From that point forward, the public record simply stopped showing what, if anything, Edward was paying annually to remain at Bagshot Park. It wasn't until the Andrew scandal forced open the broader question of royal property deals that journalists went back and reconstructed what that redaction had been hiding. What they found was that Edward's ongoing rent, like Andrew's at Royal Lodge, had effectively become a peppercorn arrangement, a token, largely nominal payment, despite the property now being worth an estimated £30 million. In other words, the market value rent that had defined the first phase of Edward's tenancy appears not to have continued once the 2007 extension was signed. There is one meaningful difference between the two brothers' deals, and it actually favors Edward, at least financially. Andrew's original lease restricted any future transfer of Royal Lodge to his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, or his daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Uaini. Edward's lease carries no such restriction. Property litigation specialists who reviewed the terms for the press have noted that Edward is free to sell his leasehold interest to essentially anyone, provided the buyer can demonstrate the financial capacity to maintain a 120-room estate, and he would be entitled to keep the proceeds. On paper, that makes Bagshot Park not just a subsidized home, but a potential financial asset Edward could eventually cash in on, something Andrew's arrangement never allowed him to do. And the property has apparently already been generating income of its own. Reporting from The Sun in mid-2026 claimed that Edward and Sophie had been earning as much as £130,000 a year by subletting a converted stable block on the estate, situated a few hundred meters from the main house, marketed to commercial tenants at a rate of over £10,000 a month. The arrangement drew criticism on the basis that a couple paying only a token rent for the core property were nonetheless profiting from renting out a portion of it themselves, with those proceeds going to Edward and Sophie rather than back into public coffers by way of the Crown Estate, whose profits are meant to benefit the Treasury. None of this means Edward has done anything unlawful. Every arrangement described here, the original lease, the 2007 extension, the redacted rent, the stable subletting, appears to have gone through the Crown Estate's own negotiation and approval process. Royal leases, property lawyers point out, are individually negotiated, and it isn't unusual for terms to vary significantly from one family member to another depending on when an agreement was struck and what conditions applied at the time. There is no indication that Edward is currently in breach of his lease, and no indication that the palace is attempting to remove him from Bagshot Park the way it moved against Andrew at Royal Lodge. What the story actually reveals is something less dramatic than a family battle, but arguably more uncomfortable for the institution as a whole: a pattern. Two brothers. Two enormous properties on Crown land. Two arrangements that, once the paperwork was finally pulled into daylight, turned out to involve nominal rent on £100 million plus real estate, at a moment when ordinary people across Britain are contending with a genuine cost of living squeeze. Andrew's version of that pattern came packaged with a scandal serious enough to cost him his titles. Edward's version came packaged with redacted land registry filings and a profitable side business subletting the stables. That contrast is precisely why this story has legs. It isn't about one prince behaving badly. It's about a property system inside the monarchy that, for decades, operated almost entirely out of public view, one where peppercorn rent wasn't the exception reserved for one troubled royal, but apparently closer to the norm for royals living on Crown Estate land, regardless of how carefully they otherwise conducted themselves. For Edward specifically, the optics are complicated. He has spent much of his adult life positioning himself as the steady one, the son who avoided scandal, who worked steadily through decades of royal patronages including the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme his father built, and who inherited the Duke of Edinburgh title in 2023 specifically because he was seen as trustworthy enough to carry his father's legacy. None of the reporting around Bagshot Park accuses him of dishonesty, but it does puncture the idea that his financial arrangements were somehow categorically different from his brother's. Where Andrew's peppercorn rent became a symbol of impunity, Edward's has become, more quietly, a symbol of how opaque the entire system of royal property has been allowed to remain, hidden behind redacted filings until outside pressure and a separate scandal forced it into view. Whether any of this changes going forward is an open question. Unlike Andrew, Edward faces no threat to his title or his residence, and there's no public indication the Crown Estate intends to revisit his lease terms. But the redacted rent figures, the stable subletting income, and the sheer scale of the property itself have already reopened a broader conversation the monarchy would probably have preferred to avoid: exactly how many working royals are living on heavily discounted terms inside some of the most valuable real estate in the country, and how much of that arrangement the public was never meant to see. For now, Bagshot Park remains exactly what it has been for nearly 3 decades, home to the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, secured by a lease that runs until the next century, on terms the public only partially understands. The mansion that was once nearly turned into a hotel became, instead, one of the more quietly revealing case studies in how the modern monarchy actually manages its property, and a reminder that the line between the responsible royal and the scandalous one may be thinner and more procedural than either brother's public image ever suggested.